Hello and welcome to Talking About Games, a show where I talk about random stuff and also video games. This week I feel like talking about Darkest Dungeon because I have been playing it a lot this week. Well, not this week, last week. I've been playing it a lot last week when I was coming up with the idea for this video and I'm sticking to it. Anyways, what was really bugging me is I've got this whole idea about Darkest Dungeon going on and I couldn't quite figure out why it was that I liked the game so much, and then I realized that it was because the game's aesthetic prepares you and teaches you how to play the game or how to approach the game. Now, I am terrible at games. I'm not great at them. I don't really like the mechanics. I am all about the style over substance of the game. I care about how the game feels. I care about how the game looks. I care about the sound design and the lore. I love lore. Lore is where I get most of my enjoyment in games. But that's not what Darkest Dungeon is. Darkest Dungeon is really based on the mechanics. And that's not my thing. But that's not bad. Mechanics are good. Mechanics-based games are good. They're fine. There's nothing wrong with them. I'm just bad at them. What was happening was I was playing Darkest Dungeon and I was having a good time, which was a little bit weird, but I'm going with it. I thought it was just because I could groove off of the cool aesthetic that Darkest Dungeon has going on. But that's not actually what happened, and I realized this a little bit later. Darkest Dungeon actually tricked me into playing the game with its aesthetic. The aesthetic lured me in, and then I learned how to play the game like a sucker. But that's my point here. That is what I want to talk about, because the aesthetic of the game is really strong, but it also sets the game up really well. And with that out of the way, I'm just going to dive straight into the XCOM comparison, because that's where this is headed. XCOM does not do this nearly as well, because in Darkest Dungeon, the aesthetic and the mechanics are very closely linked together, and they are not in XCOM. So, the similarities are fairly obvious. In both games, you're not your troops, you're this cool invisible hand guiding the characters. You're the RTS puppet master, that's what you are. They're both turn-based. In both games, you manage your characters, and then you send them out on missions, and then they come back from the missions, and then you upgrade your base. And there's a lot of randomness, because you can just get bad dice rolls, and you just lose games sometimes, and that's the way it is, and that makes the troops feel very expendable. Now, I don't really like XCOM. I respect it. I understand the appeal of XCOM, and I really get that other people like it a whole lot more than I do. But it is not the kind of thing I'm interested in. But I wanted to know why I didn't like that game, but I liked Darkest Dungeon so much. On the list of games I want to play, XCOM is near the bottom. Because I find it a slog. As soon as I get comfortable with the game, I get bored and I want to do something else. And I feel the aesthetic lends itself to that a bit, because the aliens are not an unknown, unstoppable enemy in the same way. They're aliens, and they're not even cool, mysterious aliens. They're generic aliens. They've got the whole gray thing, bug-eyed thing going on. That's been done a lot. And then they go into robots and there's big guys with green or red skin. Look, I don't remember what mutons look like. But it feels more to me like the humans are just a couple tech tiers behind the aliens when the game starts. It's not that the aliens are super powerful or anything, it's just that they're a little bit ahead. I feel that way mostly because you can catch up to them in technology. You can get the plasma weapons that they have. With the expansion, you can build mechs, and you can make psychic troops, and, well, the aliens don't have anything that you don't have then. The people in Darkest Dungeon develop both upwards and downwards a bit. Because yes, they do gain experience and level up. But the people who gain the most experience and who level up the most are also the ones who were exposed to the most diseases, get the most mental problems. A lot of those end up sticking around because it gets really expensive to fix all of those, and it's not worth the money investment. Anyways, Darkest Dungeon is a very grim, dark kind of a place. I hate that term. But it's true. Everything is really dark in Darkest Dungeon, and it's also very grim. But the heroes in the game aren't super powerful characters. They're all flawed. In XCOM, I never really get the sense that the characters are lacking in skills or have detrimental effects going on. But in Darkest Dungeon, they're full of that, and that mostly comes from the stress mechanic, where characters get stressed and then they get either positive or negative bonuses based on mostly random chance, but there are a few things you can do to impact that. And this can lead to some very interesting things, but it's even more than that, because layered on top of that, also, different characters have different voice quotes. There are even some characters that refuse to work with other characters. I really get a better sense of identity from these characters outside of simply the mechanics, because I've said before, I don't get a whole lot out of the mechanics of the game. It's all about the style of the game, the feel of the game, the look, the characters. And in XCOM, a lot of the characters are very interchangeable except for the character class and the character abilities. The characters are diverse in terms of mechanics, but the aesthetics make them all very, very similar and interchangeable. And the stress mechanic is really important in Darkest Dungeon because that's where the drawn out state comes from. And XCOM has a similar mechanic, right? In the characters panicking when someone gets injured or someone dies. But it's not nearly as persistent of a thing. It doesn't stay with you. And a lot of that is because the missions are a great deal shorter. In XCOM, you'll fight 4 or 5 groups of enemies. In Darkest Dungeon, you can easily fight 10 or so in a dungeon. It's a different style of thing as well, because every fight in Darkest Dungeon is a bit more serious because you can't get jumped by multiple groups at once. The enemies can be a bit harder. The character's stress ties the dungeon together because it's the long-term health of the character. The health is important, but you can heal that. There's a lot of healing abilities. You can eat food to heal that as well. But the stress is much harder to get rid of. The enemies give you a lot more of it, and so that ends up being the limiting factor for the length of the dungeon more so than health. Health is for the individual fights. It's the danger of the fight. Stress is the danger of the dungeon. And then they come back into the hub world, and in the hub world, the characters, when they return, they can get more quirks or more diseases. The quirks can either be positive or negative, and the negative ones can be very bad sometimes, like the ones that just straight up give you damage penalties. Really bad. I had a character with minus 5% accuracy on ranged attacks, and that can be very good if it's a melee-only character, or it can be very bad if it's a ranged-only character. So there is multiple layers of the persistence, and the characters are always sort of being attacked by the game, mechanically, but also aesthetically, and that's really where I'm getting to here, because everything about Darkest Dungeon pushes the player down. The design of the game is dark and depressing, even in the hub world where you're supposed to be safe. And you're always strapped for money and resources, and I know that you never have enough resources in XCOM. Well, at least I never did because I never got there. But the important thing is that when you go into the dungeons, it's so much worse because the enemies are strange and terrifying. The bosses are bizarre and they have much more power on an aesthetic level than you because a lot of them are much bigger. They have much larger attacks. They build up to it. And so all of this comes together to set me up expecting a difficult game. Whereas XCOM doesn't do that. XCOM has a much more neutral aesthetic, and it doesn't look quite like a difficult of game. All games sort of have this bar of you need to be this good in order to pass. And I feel like Darkest Dungeon puts the bar of the aesthetic, as in the bar that directly communicates to the player, at the same place as the bar of the mechanics. But XCOM's aesthetic bar is a lot lower, and it makes it think that the game is easier than the actual difficulty of the game is. Because XCOM doesn't tell me through the dialogue, through the visuals, through the sound design, that the game would be incredibly hard. The weird thing is, right, this mattered to me a lot more than I thought it would. With both of these games, I knew what they were before going in. Because I don't like these games so much, and so I tend to prepare them or get them through other recommendations. So I knew that they would be hard going into them. And I knew that they would be especially challenging for me because I'm not so great at these kind of games. But it didn't matter. What mattered a whole lot more was the information I was getting from the game. That the game was telling me in Darkest Dungeon through the mechanics and the aesthetics that I was going to screw up. Or that if I screwed up, people would die. Whereas in XCOM, it feels a lot more forgiving. Maybe not so much in the mechanics, but the aesthetic very much feels like you can make mistakes because you're all humans, you've got this army, you're facing a difficult threat. Games are all about communicating with the audience because that's what art is. Art is all about a communication. It's just communicating between creator, audience member. And when you send two different messages through the same thing, it's really confusing, and that can, I'm not saying it always does, but it definitely can get in the way of the player's enjoyment. That's me done. Hopefully you had a nice time. Next time, I'll be talking about Endless Legends, so come back next week.